Okay, so we'll begin. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient and Family Learning Center at Mass General Hospital. Today's program is a special collaboration between the Blum Center and Mass General Hospital for Children in observance of National Minority Health Month. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, you can visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note that everyone is in listen-only mode. Everyone has been muted so that we can hear our guest speakers today. If you have any questions for our guest speakers, please use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time for them in the end. Only Blum Center staff, the co-host, and guest speakers will see your questions. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat box. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. So next, I would like to introduce you all to Brianna Beckfold. She is the project manager and editor for Mass General Hospital for Children, and she'll introduce you all to today's guest speakers.
Great, thank you, Amy. So good afternoon. I hope you're all doing well, and thank you for coming to this virtual session of the MGHfC Parenting Series, where experts share their knowledge with patients, family, and staff on various pediatric health topics. And this year, we're co-hosting the series with the Blum Patient and Family Learning Center at Mass General. Like Amy said, my name is Brianna Beckfold, and I'm a project manager and editor at Mass General Hospital for Children, which is the pediatric branch of Mass General. And today we have three speakers. We have Dr. Aisha James, Dr. Gracia Kwete, and Dr. Carlos Torres. So before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce all of them. Dr. Aisha James is a pediatrician at the MGH Everett Healthcare Center. She is also an associate director of diversity and equity and associate diversity of advocacy at MGHfC. She earned her medical degree from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and completed her residency and chief residency here at Mass General. And before medical school, she worked as a special education teacher in New York City. And next is Dr. Gracia Kwete. She's a pediatrician at the MGH Revere Healthcare Center. She is also an associate director of diversity and equity at MGHfC and an assistant medical editor of Karma, which is a web resource for pediatricians here at Mass General. She earned her medical degree from Mayo Medical School in Rochester, Minnesota, and completed her residency here at Mass General. She was born in the Democratic Republic of Congo and moved to Zambia for most of her childhood before coming to the US for college. And we also have Dr. Carlos Torres. He is a pediatrician at the MGH Chelsea Healthcare Center and an associate director of diversity and equity at MGHfC. He earned his medical degree from Harvard Medical School and completed his residency and chief residency here at Mass General. He was born and raised in Jalisco, Mexico, before moving to Wisconsin as a teenager. So as they all present, we'll be taking questions from the audience in the chat box, and we'll answer them toward the end. And from here, I will hand it off to our speakers.
Thank you, Brianna and Amy, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to the Blum Center for inviting our team to speak today. We can move on to the next slide. So we have no financial disclosures. However, we would like to disclose that we all have different lived experiences, and we also recognize that we have conscious and unconscious biases, those of which that affect how we interpret the information we share, how we deliver this information, and how we think about these issues. And we hope to share this with you today. Next slide. Although this is virtual, we would like to acknowledge that we honor, respect, and thank the diverse Indigenous people connected to this territory on which we gather, even though we're virtual. Next slide, please. So over the next hour, we hope to cover how we talk to children about differences in the world and how we help children when they're victims of racism and discrimination, as well as discuss how we can be more intentional about creating an anti-racist society. Next slide. I think to start us off, we have to think about how do we put this into context and setting the stage. Why are we talking about this? Why does this matter? Well, a quick Google search will have you find so many images of how our world has been in turmoil and how children are also at the forefront of these issues. Next slide. You can see children protesting against anti-Asian hate. You can see children coming forward and being part of the Black Lives Matter movement. And you can see so many ways in which children are telling us that this is not the future that they want. This is not what they want to see, and being able to say that racism is wrong and that kids are against racism. Next slide. I think those questions are all rhetorical as to why this is so important. I think Nelson Mandela's words of "there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children" rings so true for all of us in all domains. So whether we're educators, clinicians, parents, guardians, in all facets in which we interact with children, I believe that this is a huge question for us to face and one that we cannot ignore. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, which helps to create some of the anticipatory guidance that we provide as clinicians to families, did come out in August of 2019 with information regarding the impact of racism on child and adolescent health. And so recognizing the potential that this has on health, the negative impact, is so important, and how to rectify this is the next step. Next slide. So what is racism? As we know, race is a social political construct, and racism is that organized system of oppression. There are levels of racism, and the key three that we would sort of talk about today will be institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized racism. I love how Dr. Kamara Jones has an allegory that really creates a visual for these three levels that can be helpful as we talk about these issues and how to address them at the different levels. So we'll just watch a short clip. I wouldn't do justice explaining, as she does a great job doing so with some visuals. So we'll watch that for a little bit.
This story is about a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms and some is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed and she puts it in the rich, fertile soil. And she takes the pink seed and she puts it in the poor, rocky soil. And 3 weeks later, she comes and she's looking at her flower boxes, and what she notices is that every single one of the red seeds has sprouted. And some of the seed is tall, some of the red flowers are tall and strong and flourishing. The weak seed in the red at least has sprouted and made it to a middling height. But when she looks in the pink box, in that poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed has died. And the strong pink seed is just struggling to make it to a middling height. And then those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year, the same thing happens, until finally, 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, "You know, I was right to prefer red over pink." Now we'll interrupt that to say that this first part of the story is how institutionalized racism works. You had the initial historical insult of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the flower boxes, the contemporary structural factors, keeping the soil separate. And then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of that difference. But now we're going to pick the story back up and say, well, where would personally mediated racism be in this garden? Well, that's when the gardener's looking at her flowers and she says, "Those pink flowers are so scraggly and scrawny," and she plucks those blossoms off before they can even go to seed. Or she might notice that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil and she plucks it out before it can establish itself. And then where would internalized racism be in this garden? Well, you have the pink flowers in their box trying to make it, looking over at red, which is all flourishing and flaunted. And here come the bees. And the bees are minding their own business. They're just collecting nectar, but they're pollinating at the same time. So the bees are buzzing around. Here come the bees to the pink flowers. Bzz, bzz, and it comes over to this one pink flower. Bzz, and the pink flower says, "Get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red." Because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So then the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, you could say, well,
Okay, thank you, Carlos. So that was setting the stage of how we think about the three levels of racism. And so when we think about the soil analogous to the environment that we are raising our children in, we see that that has a huge impact on development of children and adolescents. And so when we think of the social determinants of health, you think of poverty, you think of other forms of disparities, but most importantly, sometimes the confounder in all of this is also racism. And we know that racism has a significant adverse effect on both the individuals receiving, committing, and observing racism. And so the interpersonal relationships are clear and important to be addressed. Next slide. So we know that exposure to systemic racism activates the stress response within our bodies. And so prolonged exposure to elevated stress hormones lead to inflammatory reactions, predisposing people to chronic illnesses, which include anxiety, including heart disease. And so this is impacting our children's learning, behavior, and mental health, which is a negative impact that we can recognize with discrimination. Next slide. So the question is then, what can we do about tipping the scales from a structurally racist society to being anti-racist? This afternoon, my colleagues will be sharing ways that we can begin to be more intentional about how we reduce implicit biases as we pass them on to the next generation, whether it's fostering curiosity by creating a common identity, and then also creating empathy in our children as we think about perspective taking and having conversations around differences. And then also how we not only tell children what to think, but actually create an environment where we can teach them how to think and how to be critical thinkers so that they can stop and really think about the media that they're consuming, how things are portrayed in the media, and really fight against the racist assumptions that are made in society. And so this could include reading books as adults, and then also having literature for children as well. And so my colleagues this afternoon will share some of this information.
Thank you, Gracia, for doing such a great job in setting the stage, that it's really important to address this topic. And I'm gonna try to get us started on how to talk to children about differences. And we're gonna use race as our prototype of our type of ism, right, for racism, with the hopes that we can apply what we learn around race, talking about race, to other other differences like ableism, sex and gender identity, and other of those differences towards the end. And I'm gonna focus on the younger kids because their developmental stage matters. And then Dr. James will focus on the older kids and the adolescents. So with preschool-aged children, one of the big themes that I wanna convey to you all is the importance of starting early. And the rationale behind starting early is that children can actually distinguish visual differences associated with race by 6 months. And I was baffled when I was reading about this because it's much earlier than I would have thought. And by age 4, when they're in school, there's evidence that biases have already developed. And some of those can become ingrained or harder to kind of rationalize in the adolescent years. And the goal of having these conversations are to recognize differences, to accept that they're true and that we teach our kids how to see them, and also celebrating similarities. And the way to kind of approach these topics is to think about their developmental stage and talk about it with openness and honesty. And an example of this is that we all want our kids to grow up being kind to people. So kind of using that messaging, for example, of saying how it's important to be kind to people of all colors. And I'll give a few other examples as we go through. So big theme is starting early. The next theme is that before we actually think about talking to kids, we need to do some self-work first. we need to be mindful of that and do some introspection. There's a saying, how more is caught than taught. And we're gonna hope to share some pearls with y'all. But as you see, it's gonna, the kids pick up a lot from not things that we actually intentionally teach. We are role models, so being mindful of what we say, but also probably even more importantly of what we do. And with the introspection, one of the exercises that we've learned as we've been doing this work is through cultural sharing that was shared with us by Visions, which is a nonprofit group in Dorchester. And they provide some questions to kind of get us thinking about it. Because one of the comments that I get is like, well, I'm not sure if I identify with a particular culture. And the reality is that we all have cultures, whether we know it or not. So going through these questions may be nice. And they include, how do you identify racially, ethnically, culturally? So for me, I identify as Latinx, and I grew up in a Mexican household. What kind of class background of the family you grew up in? And I grew up in a working class family. And name one thing that you like and one thing that you don't like about that identification. And the rationale behind this is that we are part of groups, right? And that comes with some positive things that we like, and also some things that we may not necessarily like. I love how in my culture is very communal. So when there is both celebratory things or time of mourning, we come together for it. One thing that I don't like is that sometimes we can be late to things, and that tardiness. I've grown up in this more Eurocentric community that we need to be on time, right? And using Latinx or island time as an excuse is something that kind of bothers me a little bit. So again, the theme being that it's really important to consider these introspection first before we can actually truly talk authentically about it, and that there's going to be things that we like about our groups and things that we don't like. And the other thing is that we're not all the same, right? There's differences within groups, and kind of highlighting that it's also going to be very important. So before we talk a few pearls as to how we talk about it, I want to tell you about a theory of racial socialization, which is the idea that parents of underrepresented youth are tasked with teaching their children how to navigate in a world with conflicting messages. And an example of this is parents of Black kids teaching them how to navigate in a white world, right? Where they will encounter messages that are conflicting with whom they are. And the study of this theory has taught us a lot of things that I want to share with you all. One of them is the importance of cultural pride, of knowing and loving who you are, right? With all the things that we like and that we don't like. Also the importance of even talking about it, right? So that's why we want to, we're very happy to share this with you all. And also the idea of being colorful and not colorblind, that it's okay to notice skin color and talk about race, and also celebrate those similarities, because we do have a lot of those. And the other thing is that for underrepresented youth, that it's really important to develop a positive racial identity, and that it's going to be protective for optimal youth development. So being proud and knowing who you are is going to be really, really important. So the other thing is, right, so we started about talking about starting early, doing our introspection and our self-work, being mindful about our modeling. And the last thing is, like, let's get some help. And supplementing these discussions are going to be important. And one of the places that does a really good job is Sesame Street. So I wanted to share with you how they approach this topic. And then I'll kind of summarize some of the takeaways, the nice pearls that we can learn from them. So let me share my video.
Dad, I think today's perfect.
A full day weather forecast of sunny skies and smiles.
Hi,
Mr.
Elijah!
Hey, Elmo!
What are you two doing? Dad and I are taking a break from our nature walk.
Yep, and we stop for a moment to enjoy the colorful leaves.
Yeah.
Oh, look, Elmo, the leaves are falling.
Yeah. Look. This leaf is red like Elmo's fur. Oh, and this leaf is brown like Russ's skin.
Good observation, Elmo.
Oh, thank you. Oh, Elmo has a question.
Oh, what is it, Elmo?
Elmo wants to know why Russ's skin is brown.
Oh, I know why, Elmo. My mom and Dad told me. It's because of melanin. Right, Dad?
That's right.
Melanin? Oh, what's that?
Well, melanin is something that we each have inside our bodies that make the outside of our bodies the skin color that it is. It also gives us our eye and our hair color.
Oh, and our fur color?
Yes, that's right, exactly, Elmo.
Oh, but if we all have melanin, why are we different colors? Like, why is Mr. Elijah's skin a darker brown than Russ's skin?
Oh, that's a good question, Elmo. Well, it's because the more melanin you have, the darker your skin looks. The color of our skin is an important part of who we are. But we should all know that it's okay that we all look different in so very many ways.
Oh, well, Elmo's fur is red and soft.
Oh, and my hair is black and curly.
Things on the outside, like our skin color, our hair texture, our noses, our mouths and eyes, make us who we are. Many people call this race. But even though we look different, we're all part of the human race.
Isn't it cool, Elmo?
Very cool.
Look at the leaves. What do you two see?
Elmo sees leaves that are all different colors.
And the different colors look really cool together.
Yes, those leaves came from one amazing tree. Standing strong, its branches like arms stretched wide, with leaves of many different colors, side by side swaying together in the breeze.
Oh, like this? Wow.
Yeah.
When people of all colors come together, we stand strong, like this tree.
Yeah. Oh, look, Elmo. This leaf looks just like us. Two colors side by side.
It's beautiful.
Beautiful together.
So I learned English with Sesame Street. So it's a very special show for me, and it makes me so happy to see that they're really addressing these challenging topics. So what can we take away from the video and other things? One of the important things is to use simple words and concepts that our younger children can understand. And the video talked about this leaf is red and this leaf is brown. I like the melanin example because it kind of gave a scientific way to describe the skin. Even though we are different, we're all part of the human race. And that's a very important topic to kind of a message to kind of address. PBS Kids has a lot of really nice tools that we can use. So wanted to give them a shout out. As kids get older, it may be a good starting point is checking in what they know already and also model for them when we don't know the answers. And Dr. James will kind of give us a few pointers on that. I talked about supplementing our discussions with picture books that show various types of people. And these picture books don't need to be about race, right? Underrepresented youth and races of all colors need to be shown because we're part of life. So that's another important thing. Having toys that show multicultural adults or figures, television shows that I kind of showed you. For people who grow up in homogeneous communities, visiting playgrounds in different communities may be really nice. And again, the theme of learning and appreciating cultures of other groups is going to be super important. Two of my favorite books that talk about this is one is from Sesame Street, We're Different, We're the Same, and We're All Wonderful. And then a book by Just Ask by Sonia Sotomayor, who is one of my big heroes. And there's a lot of lists out there. If you just Google anti-racist books for kids. You'll get a big list. And the last plug is for an organization called Embrace Race that was founded by parents to address this issue, talking about race. And they also have really nice curated stuff that I encourage you all to check out. And now that we kind of talked about some pointers of how to get these conversations started, focusing on race, I was hoping that we can put what we learned to practice. And one of my colleagues shared a podcast that I also would highly recommend from My New Life called Embracing Differences, Raising Kind, Empathetic Kids. And the podcast opens up with this excerpt that I'm going to share with you. We were at the park this weekend and my daughter B was staring at a woman in a wheelchair. I found myself tensing up when she loudly asked, "Mama, why is that woman on a moving chair?" Nicole Stamp is featured here. So let's take maybe 15 seconds, which are going to feel very long, but just think about how would you respond to this? Would you respond? So, Mama, why is that woman on a moving chair? And some of the options that we may have is we can ignore the question, we can tense up and tell them to be quiet, and we're all going to be in scenarios where that may happen. I hope we inspired you to maybe use this as a conversation starter in talking about differences. Some comments that we kind of come up together that you may want to use is not sure. All people are different, and it allows her to get around while you're answering her question. Some people, in some circumstances, it may be appropriate to involve the person. In this case, I would argue that it wouldn't be appropriate because we don't know her. So, but if we knew her, we could ask to see if she wanted to tell us, but we don't. So that would not be nice of us. And another thing to think about is, well, the important thing is that just like you and me, she's able to get around, and we treat her just how we would like to be treated, kindness and respect. And again, you're addressing ableism and the importance of disability inclusion, and at the same time with a very general message of that we all want to raise kids who are kind and respectful in this world, and that's a way to do it. So now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. James.
Thank you so much, Carlos. So now that our young children have all of these positive associations about all different types of people, we're going to introduce the concept of discrimination and racism. Next slide. So when, where, and how are we going to have these hard conversations? So one, as Carlos referenced, children as young as age 4 already have internalized some positive and negative biases about racial groups. So we recommend starting these conversations early and at for young school-age children. Again, we want to make sure that we're using developmentally appropriate language. And so for a young child who's 6 or 7, you don't want to be talking about, violence or trauma, but you can still highlight that, that it's really important that we treat all people with kindness. But unfortunately, in our world and in our country, some people are not treated fairly because of the color of their skin, and that's wrong. We want to have these conversations often. One, because this is going to help reinforce the importance of equity. And just like we have multiple conversations about bullying and about substance use in our youth, we want to similarly have multiple conversations about racism and discrimination. In addition to helping reinforce this concept, it also takes away the pressure from you having like one perfect conversation about racism with your child, and takes the pressure off your child as well. So some things you can do is do it in a low pressure setting, like when you're driving in the car, so maybe you don't need to have eye contact, at bedtime. And in addition to taking some of the pressure off yourself, it also can help make the conversation less intense. Because sometimes if we do a more like sit down intense conversation, it could have unintended consequences where our children might feel like, ooh, like talking about different people is super intense and maybe I want to avoid them. And know that you will not have all the answers. You can talk to your pediatrician, you can use some of the resources Carlos referenced, like Embrace Race, to help you with these conversations, and that's okay. Next slide. And again, in addition to not having all the answers, we're also going to make mistakes. And as our education colleagues say, mistakes should be expected, respected. We're happy they happen because this is how we're going to learn. Inspected, so when they happen, we're not going to turn away from them. We're going to investigate them and see what happened, and then corrected so that we can learn from them and not make that mistake in the future. And again, I want to emphasize that there is no perfect conversation, and that all of these conversations are going to be very different depending on your identity and the identity of your family, whether you are part of a more like a upper class, heterosexual, Christian, white family, a blended family, everybody's experiences are going to be different. So a great way to introduce this topic is with current events. One, because your child might bring it up with you, and so then the conversation happens naturally. And the other is because our children are going to are aware of what's happening in the world around them, and we do want to talk with them so that they don't form any misconceptions or interpret things in the wrong way. So here's some questions that you could ask your child. So, when you're walking around, you may see a rainbow flag in someone's yard or a Black Lives Matter sticker on a car. So you can ask your child, did you see that Black Lives Matter sticker? Do you know what that's for? Your child may respond like, oh, well, I'm confused. I thought that all lives matter. And this is a great time that you can say, yes, you're right. And this sign means that Black lives matter too. Because unfortunately in our country, sometimes Black people are not treated well because of the color of their skin, and that's wrong. For an older child, for an adolescent, you want to provide more context. And so you can share, you're right, this sign means Black lives matter too. And that's because in our country, we know that Black people experience more police brutality and are more likely to be killed by the police, and that this is wrong. And this sign is reminding us that that's wrong and that we need to work to combat that and prevent that from happening. And this can lead to a more in-depth and serious and difficult conversation, but that is really important to have, in that some children and families, the police are going to be a source of protection and safety, and for other families are going to be a source of danger. And so it's important for our children to know that. In addition, you can also share your own, how you feel witnessing current events. So you could share, it's been really upsetting for me to see Asian Americans being blamed for the coronavirus, being hurt or even killed. It makes me think about how hard and sad and scary it could be to be an Asian American right now. Again, sort of role modeling for your child. Next slide. In addition, we want to learn ourselves and then teach our children about sort of the systems of oppression that exist in our society. Unfortunately, our current education system doesn't always teach a lot about the many different groups of people that have been in this country for generations. And so we need to supplement our children's education. So, around Thanksgiving, there are a lot of false narratives about Native American history and the Native Americans that still live with us in our country today. So on this slide, I have some images. So I'm from Eastern Massachusetts, and many of us probably are here. And so in Eastern Massachusetts, we can teach our children, has long been the home of the Wampanoag people for over 10,000 years before Europeans arrived. So that first painting is a painting of Massasoit, who was one of the chiefs of the Wampanoag. And we could teach our children that when Europeans arrived, unfortunately, many Wampanoags were killed, sold into slavery, and eventually they were pushed off all of their land. And even today, the Wampanoag people and many Native Americans are still fighting for the very little land that they have left. And in the other image, we have youth who are participating in protests a few years ago to fight for sacred land. So in addition to teaching about history and current events, we want to help our children recognize racism, because sometimes it can be very subtle. Many people, things like microaggressions. And so, we could teach our children that today there are many colloquial sayings that are actually racist and insulting to the Native American people. So if you hear someone using the term redskin, Indian giver, or saying someone's off the reservation, these are not things that we should say. And if we heard someone saying that, we should correct them. Next slide. So as Gracia had referenced before, even young children have witnessed or experienced racism at a very young age. So we want to ask our children about these experiences to see if they've had them and sort of support them if they have. So we always want to have open-ended questions. So you can ask your child, do you feel like you've ever been treated differently or unfairly, and ask them why? Your child may share that they were treated unfairly because they were not good at soccer, or they may share that they felt that they were treated unfairly because they wore a hijab or they had an accent. And so this is an opportunity to sort of explore that feeling and, talk more about this subject. With older children, you want to use the term. So you can ask them, have you or someone you cared about been impacted by racism or discrimination. It's a good opportunity also to share your own experiences, because sometimes the experience of discrimination can feel very isolating. So it's helpful to share with your children. So, eventually, my son is very, very little now, but eventually, I will share with him that I have experienced racism. And I can remember growing up that my friend said that the area I lived was ghetto. And this made me feel bad, because it made me think that the area that all the Black people lived in my town was bad. And even though it was really upsetting for me, I actually never told my friends. And even if you feel like I don't feel like I've experienced a lot of discrimination, you can still share experiences of privilege and how upsetting it can be to witness discrimination. So an example would be that as a Christian person, I realize that I'm really lucky that I've never experienced any discrimination because of my religion. And it makes me think about how scary and upsetting it could be for my friends and other people who are Jewish, Muslim, and other religions that experience discrimination in our country. Next slide. So as you're asking your child these questions, if your child does share that they have experienced discrimination, you want to, one, remind your child that the feelings that they have are justified and that they are not to blame for the behaviors for the racist behaviors they were the target of, and avoid trying to explain or maybe defend the source of the racist behavior. You also want to make sure, remind your child that they should ask for help if they're feeling sad, worried, unsafe, depressed when this sort of thing happens. Similarly, it's important for our adolescents to be, aware of what's going on in the world. However, too much exposure to negative media, news media, or social media can be traumatic. And so we want to help our children limit that. Remind them of all the wonderful things about their cultural identity. And there's good data to show that when youth join others in combating discrimination, racism, or other forms of oppression, that this can actually be really therapeutic for children. And unfortunately, the experience and the trauma of discrimination can lead to mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. So if you find that your child is having more serious symptoms, you want to help them get the help that they need. Next slide. And similarly, witnessing, even if you're not the target, witnessing discrimination is very upsetting as well. And so if our children witness discrimination, again, we want to support them and let them know that their feelings are okay and that what happened was wrong. And then help them to support their friends or just people that they see who have experienced discrimination so that they feel like they are part of the solution, and have them join these youth organizations as well. Next slide. So to conclude, we wanted to remind everyone, one, talk with your children early and often about all different types of people, celebrating all of our differences as well as our similarities. We want our children to have lots of positive associations before we start talking about racism or other forms of discrimination. But we do want to have these conversations early too. And we want to talk with our children so that they can recognize it and then combat it. When children who experience and witness racism need our support, and remember that we're all in this together. None of us have all the answers, and we're gonna sort of make the world a better place by supporting our youth. Our last slide, we wanted to thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to answering some of your questions, and we're ending with this lovely quote by Maya Angelou.
Great, thank you very much. So we do have some questions and comments in the chat box. So if you have anything, please be sure to add those into the chat box and I'll read them out loud for everyone. We have a lot of positive praise for Sesame Street, which is just wonderful. One of my favorites as a kid as well. One question is, how can we deal with negative interactions that are racially based from other children in preschool or school? How can we help our children navigate all white spaces? And whoever wants to answer that can do so.
I can get us started, and then Aisha and Gracia, you can jump in. I think for the first part of the question of how to navigate, particularly in this preschool area, I think forming a community with the teachers and those that work closely with the children will be important, and the allyship that can happen, particularly because they are the ones who carry the power in terms of telling, of kind of addressing the kids. So I've had really good experiences with parents who've been able to do sessions with the teachers who are then able to kind of impart those teachings to the children. What else would you say, Gracia and Aisha?
Yeah, I think one thing I have to add is, I think we talked about it a little bit of definitely having those conversations, because children can feel that they're going through something on their own. And so having that open communication is important. And I think earlier in the talk, we sort of talked about the different levels of racism, and thinking about how certain things can be really personally mediated, right? And so continuing to think of, and we didn't have enough time to delve into this today, but thinking of other institutional tactics or approaches to improving the setting for children. And so, as Carlos mentioned, talking to the teachers or things that are more higher level, so that it's really thinking about how certain environments might be propagating some of the unfair behavior that's occurring. And so thinking about how to be involved in sort of, whether it's a parent or working with teachers and working with creating allies, right? We talked a lot about how even as bystanders, right, children are being affected by seeing their friend being treated differently. And so thinking of how we are creating allies and working to create a safe space for our children.
I don't see other questions, but I see lots and lots of positive praise. Okay. If there are any other questions, please be sure to enter them. If not, it looks like we can wrap up a few minutes early. So
I think, well,
we
I
have
could
one
address
person
the second
asking.
part of the question about the how
Oh yeah, go
can we
ahead.
help our children navigate all white spaces.
Yes.
And I will start by disclosing that, you know, I would not say I am the expert on this, but I would love to hear what Gracia and Carlos believe as well as other people have their own experiences and share in the chat. I do think that, you know, if your child is I will speak about it from both perspectives. Like if your child is a child of color, I think that you want to definitely give them those like really positive knowledge about their own cultural identity, and to like explain to your child that they are different. And so that I think that there can be harm when we don't have these conversations, and, you know, children may like perceive themselves as white. I can say that as like a mixed race person. So, you know, my mother is white and my father is Black, and I grew up in mostly white spaces. And there can, like, I had a lot of internalized conflict sometimes, like with this concept of like being in an Oreo cookie, so Black on the outside, white on the inside. And I've had friends who are other races who have had similar, that coconut, brown on the outside, banana, yellow on the, so there's lots of like of these things where you're one of the only people of color. So I think acknowledging your child's racial difference and celebrating that, I think is super important. And then if you can, you know, have opportunities to engage with people of with same cultural backgrounds at times, or with just like other different cultural backgrounds. So instead of being mostly in a white space, you know, it's like someone who identifies as Black, being in a space where there may be people of lots of different racial identities, whether or not that's Black or not, can be helpful. And I think what's important, this, I think I definitely will speak on less my own experience, but I think if you're in just like a homogenous space, so it's like I identify as like a white parent and my children are basically mostly all like with white children, or a Black parent and my children are mostly all with Black children, is that really supplementing a lot with, you know, the media that you're exposing your children to, the toys they have, the books they have. And like Carlos was mentioning, not just like a book with like many different races talking about differences, but like a book about pirates, and like the pirate is, you know, an Asian character, and books about an astronaut, and the astronaut is a Black character, and sort of just exposing them to lots and lots of differences. And if you have the opportunity to go to spaces where there's going to be lots of different children, I think that's helpful as well. Sorry, I kind of rambled.
Yeah, no, that's a great response. And while you were talking, we had some more questions come in. So, is there any advice for searching for anti-racist school environments?
I think talking to people is going to be very powerful, right? Because I think that that's going to be important. I know that in my community, right, like talking to neighbors and even like reading the newspapers, you kind of learn what's going on. So I think the power of connections is going to be important in this topic. What else would you all be thinking, Gracia and Aisha?
I think that's talking to others is really important. And I think there's a follow-up question since I'm reading in the chat about how do you help the school then transition, right? And I think that sometimes that might be where the work comes in, right? Is that it's how you start these discussions and trying to be intentional about the transitions and I think when thinking about this as a systems issue, it's things have been a certain way for so long and how can we actively counteract them? So really thinking about these concepts of, for example, privilege, right? Of recognizing that we have Black History Month, for example, but like, are we learning about the history of Asian and Pacific Islanders, right? And how we're getting bits and pieces within the curriculum of the schools. So how can we really challenge and say, wow, we have all these gaps and how can we make sure that we're piecing everything together and moving forward with that. And whether it's the literature in the schools, the books, the way the curriculum is set up, the media, all these things that are so important, the images, right? And I think there's so many spaces where we can challenge these things, whether it's your doctor's office, right? What are the images on the walls? What are the books that are being handed out, right? The reach out and read books, whether it's you're hospitalized and your child gets a book in the playroom, right? There's so many places where we can really start to challenge and ask questions and see how we can move forward with that. And I think another comment I had regarding how to navigate white spaces, I think it's also recognizing what we mean by that, right? And so helping kids also think in a global sense of in one space, someone might be a minority, but like thinking about the global world in a sense, for example, whether it's a language situation where your child sort of can think globally of, oh, there's so many people in the world who speak this other language, even though in this group of people, I am the only one who speaks a certain language. And so keeping the idea of what it actually means to say white spaces, which really means it's being in a system where there is a certain standard bar that utilizes a certain race as the standard versus how do we normalize everyone as being equal.
And even challenging that notion of like white spaces, right? Like why are there white spaces, right? And often children don't have as much agency and control, but parents do, right? So how do we generally and authentically challenge those spaces and involve people so that they're no longer white spaces where they represent who we are as a community?
Great. Aisha, did you want to add anything or do you want to move on to the next question? No? Okay. I would love to hear more about how you'd recommend parents supporting the school, such as offering resources to help support an anti-racist curriculum.
Yeah, I think that was touched upon a little bit regarding whether it's images, imagery, literature, so the books that they're exposed to and the media that they're exposed to. And I think that we can learn a lot from other spaces too. And I think, for example, I can think about medical school education, right? That's a space where they're also challenging dermatology books, right? Or even when you Google images of a rash or something, right? Like what are the images that are coming up? And so I think that it's all has to be done simultaneously, and we could definitely have ways that we learn from other spaces in terms of our education system and how that can be more diverse and inclusive.
And I would just highlight that, you know, we are like not a group of education experts, and I my sister is a teacher, and she had shared with me that she had found some like really amazing podcasts and resources on like creating anti-racism and like inclusive curriculum. So I know that there are experts out there for the education system, and maybe as caregivers for our children, if we just make our voices heard to our education system, is like that this is something that we really care about, and like we'll work with you to find those experts, but like probably you have some of those experts too, and that just might give them the agents, like make them feel empowered to do that, because people, it's always hard to change and like it can feel uncomfortable. And so I think if we can make our educators feel supported in making that change, that can be something that, you know, parents and caregivers can do.
Yeah, and I think with sort of the touching upon educators and the facets in which everyone touches a child's life, right? I've heard some people are aunts on here and all these things. I think the first teachers, of course, are parents, right? Parents are the first teachers. And so how do we sort of help with the books we're giving out, whether it's in a Reach Out and Read program, all the contact we have with helping build the next generation to a better future.
Great. Our next question is, what are your thoughts on families who consciously move into dissimilar neighborhoods? From this person's experience, it does not always produce children who are more open, even if the family is very supportive of the integration.
I think that is a good question to ask. And I think even as we've talked about many ways that we can help introduce diversity and inclusivity in a child's life, we have to also recognize that as human beings, we have a tendency to make exceptions, right? You'll say, oh, I met this one person who was different from the group, and so still hold certain ideas about a certain group. And so, and that's why it's so important to sort of think of how to help kids think critically and not necessarily what they should think, and really, and so I think it is a challenge, right? And I think that's an ongoing challenge of how one interaction with one person, and everyone is so unique, everyone is so different. And so really continuing to teach the ability to appreciate our implicit biases, the ways in which we still make an exception, right? The exception rule of like, I met this one person who was different, but I still believe that the whole entire group is one, right? And so it's really a lot of critical thinking and really challenging those questions and biases that, and sort of ways of thinking that we can still fall back on to challenge that. And so it certainly doesn't make this work easy, and involves a lot of active work for sure.
I would just, this is in no way answering the question, but I would just highlight that question again, just like highlights how we need to address these systems of oppression that create such segregation in the places where we live, that there is like, that you have to actively be like, oh, well, I'm going to go into this neighborhood because this is where all of these people live, and this neighborhood has all these people, and how we still have so much to do on large systems levels to sort of break down those barriers. So sort of everyone could live in the, you know, the best place that works for them, and that have access to the education and health and green spaces and all of the things that are going to make them sort of healthy and happy.
I think one other point I wanted to make too was regarding, we sort of talked about the systems and interpersonal racism. And then the other one that's so important is internalized racism, right? Especially when we think about how we talk to young children about differences, or if they've experienced any differences. It's, as Aisha James shared, asking the question of, have you ever been treated unfairly? Why do you think so, right? Because children have ideas and they fill in the gaps if we do not help them, right? And so it's so important to sort of check our own biases as we share this with children, because we wouldn't want to, again, build in these implicit biases, even though they might have a positive view of themselves, and say, oh, did you think they treated you differently because you're Black, right? And so it's very, being intentional and diligent. And the hope of this presentation is just being able to have thought about these ahead of time, and started to sort of have a little bit in your toolbox to have these conversations, because Children notice when we squeeze our hands or walk the other way or shy away more than anything else. And so hopefully this helps with breaking that ice.
Great, thank you. Just checking the chat box one last time. I don't see any more questions coming through, but I think this was a really great and timely presentation. So thank you to all of you. And thank you everyone for attending, of course.
Thank you.
And thank you. As I mentioned, if anyone's interested in viewing the recording of today's session, it will be made available on the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Thanks so much everyone for joining us today. Hope you found it helpful and have a lovely rest of the day.